So yeah, as mentioned, I'm one of the SEs here with HashiCorp, and we just had a great talk. We just had two great. In fact, we've had great talks all afternoon, but a couple that I really wanted to delve into. Lockie spoke a lot about the adoption of public cloud and how they've been able to accelerate that through their use with Terraform. Now, not all customers have, I guess, the dubious luxury of being able to say, we're just going to migrate everything into the public cloud. And so they're looking for the ways and means of which they can actually start to apply some of those principles within the four walls of their data center. So what I'd like to ask you to consider as I talk today, and just keep this in the back of your mind, what would it change for you? What would it change for your organization? What would it change for your projects if your own private data center was actually as just as programmable as the public clouds were? Now, there are some pretty good reasons why this is not the case. Now, when you walk into your data center, and I'm going to make an assumption here, right, which is that your data centers look like the same ones that I used to operate within. And for me, whenever I would, sort of walk down the aisles of a data center, the infrastructure was basically like a museum of IT projects from the past. We had, what did we have? We'd have like a filer on one side that was part of the knowledge management system refresh. There was the bright and shiny pure storage array that was brought in because the database performance was not up to scratch and we needed to get those batch jobs running more quickly. The F5s were brought in because we wanted to have multi-data center resiliency for our application traffic. Gosh, I could go through all of these, and VMware probably is one of those core technologies in the data center too. Everybody's looking for the benefits of, deeper consolidation and some of the stuff that virtualization would actually bring. And, that's pretty fantastic, but, it creates a lot of unique challenges for us as operations folk and as engineers actually trying to work on these environments. And as a result, what we really see, and again, Lockie sort of called out this idea, right? When we look to the left of that diagram, teams tend to grow up around the skill sets that they're needing to employ. And, with good reason, each one of these actually require you to really have a solid understanding of exactly how to tune this infrastructure to get the absolute best out of it. You're not going to see the same skills across, what are broad-reaching technologies. And arguably, even when we're talking about people who are working in the networking space, you're not necessarily going to have your Cisco folk looking after your F5 load balancers. You may, right? But it's not necessarily a given. Now, the way this sort of manifests itself into a challenge for us when it comes to actually trying to work in a more dynamic manner is effectively this, right? And if I go to, say, in the beginning, I go to my VMware team and I say, look, I need a virtual machine. They then have to go off and submit tickets down the path to say, hey, I need an IP address. I need to get the appropriate host name. I'm going to talk to security about certificates and, hand off the responsibility to them for configuring certificate revocation lists and all the rest. And by the time all that's happened, a week's passed, and maybe a week isn't so bad overall. But then we start to get into the stuff that is, particularly viewed as, risky, a lot more fragile, and as a result takes us a lot longer and has a lot more sort of structure and control around. And these are typically our networking devices, right? All right, so here we are. Here we are on the screen that I was on, right? And when we start to look across organizations, enterprises, those things like requesting a firewall rule or requesting a load balancer, configuration change, they tend to be operating, less on the scale of days and more on the scale of weeks. And for medium-sized organizations, this may take, 2 or 3 weeks. In some of our larger enterprise customers, we've seen these things taking, up to 3 months to actually occur. So that's a massive, massive time payment. Some of the other challenges that we actually see is that because a lot of these skills are so specialized, they actually get outsourced to managed service providers. And so when we look at something like a load balancer change, I was talking to a customer recently when every single change that they actually wanted to implement was going to cost them $5,000 when they actually reached out to the service provider. So you can imagine if you're going to be instantiating, multiple releases per week, and each one of those is going to consist of, compute, network, and storage changes, that cost, if you were actually able to release at that velocity, would just be almost untenable. So you get the picture here, right? Each step along the way requires specialized skills, specialized people, and even if they're actually employing their own automation, the reality is there's no way to sort of hand that off in a smart way. So the ticket itself may only take 2 minutes, 5 minutes to actually get done, but in practice, it's sitting there in a queue for who knows, a day, a week, and so we end up with this sort of compounded problem. So what if then? What if we were able to swap it out and say, look, the thing that we're actually going to go for here is a removal of tickets. And again, Lockie sort of talked about this a little bit earlier. He talked about being able to use pull requests. I'm going to talk about API contracts, but conceptually, we're talking towards the same thing, which is how do we get away from heavily human processes and heavily manual processes and move things, forward in a state whereby a lot of this requesting is actually offloaded, so that rather than, as I said, human processes, we're actually starting to look more at machine-to-machine communications and machine-to-machine systems to actually handle what all this looks like. So that's a great nirvana to get to, right? But if we were to phrase this in a slightly different way, how do we actually deliver a standard means of interfacing with all this disparate infrastructure? And as you'll guess, one of our products is completely built off this entire premise. Now, with over 200 providers and counting, we see a lot of focus going and a lot of attention, rightly so, going into what we can do in the public cloud. The cool thing is that a lot of the lessons that people are learning, the lessons around how to actually move more quickly, how to remove those process blockages, are actually now starting to flow back towards on-premises. And while I'm definitely saying this is a problem that we can solve with technology, the reality is that at its heart, it's not actually a technical problem. It is very much about the operating model and about just how much you're actually willing to change yourselves in order to see these benefits realized. So if we can implement Terraform as a starting point as a technical solution to providing a consistent API contract between all of our infrastructure, then we've managed to unblock one of those major challenges with working and automating within our data center. So then we move on to the second problem. And this is Lockie's slide, right? This is Lockie's diagram. And if we look over on our left and we talk about traditional IT, let's talk about an on-premises or more static operational model, right? We've already identified that the technology is not necessarily the problem, but what do we see? Apart from the idea of fiefdoms, and apart from the idea that people are actually, have their own skill sets, what we see is a lack of collaboration and a lack of ability to work in smarter ways with each other. As we move to more towards this hybrid IT model, we're starting to see some skill sharing, right? Team boundaries are being broken down, but I think what becomes more important in this model is the idea of it's no longer somebody else's problem. And when we start to see teams working together, what it starts to do is get away from some of those more boutique ways of actually automating solutions in place. So if I look across this example, right, virtualization is a good place to start. A lot of people do their automation in that place by leveraging, Power CLI or PowerShell because they've come from that Windows background. Networking teams may, do things like, TMUX or multiplexing terminal connections so that they can operate with multiple devices at once. Storage teams, they're probably still a little bit backwards and maybe using something like Perl, right? But bringing these teams together helps them to start standardizing and start sharing that information. And to be honest, it really is that sharing of information and skills that is the main blocker. Now, Unfortunately, we don't live in the matrix, right? It's not as simple as just saying, right, what we're going to do is take the skills of our network engineers and hand those over to it's like the Linux team. We're not going to be able to transfer all the knowledge and experience and the paranoia of our security teams and just inject those into the team that are responsible for managing our load balancers. And so the question becomes, how do we actually go about scaling the expertise of our specialists? How do we take that knowledge that's actually in their heads and make that available to everybody? So then that capability can actually roll out across your organization. And, again, Lockie, you've stolen my thunder significantly, and we're going to have a talk about this after the fact. But in seriousness, it all comes down to this idea of how can we actually use something like modules and the private module registry within Terraform Enterprise to take some of those capabilities and some of that specialist knowledge and allow other people to actually consume those. So what I'm going to do now is actually just jump in and show you guys a little bit of what this actually looks like. And a little bit of how you could actually take advantage of this within your own environment. All right, so let's just hide a few of these meeting controls. Brilliant. All right. So this UI that I'm in at the moment is the UI that you get from Terraform Enterprise. And the majority of the work that you would typically do leveraging infrastructure as code is going to be within an IDE, right? Because ClickOps isn't scalable. It doesn't particularly work that well at speed. But for the sake of showing you what this potentially starts to look like, I just wanted to give you this, this small tour. Now, when we actually go about building these out, let's come in here. The idea that goes into a module is really that it's purely just Terraform code, right? So any of this that you're actually seeing on screen at the moment, and in fact, this is a fairly handy and timely example. So the session that we just had, we were talking about things like vault configuration. We were talking about the mechanisms that you need to perform in order to configure things like app role and how you'd actually go about injecting secrets into machines. So here's an example of module code basically that would allow you to communicate with Vault to actually create a PKI cert on the back end. Now, realistically, there's probably not going to be a lot of people in your organization who are going to understand what the prerequisites are to configure this. So your role then is to come in and say, all right, I'm going to actually configure all of this for you so that you just need to provide me with a number of minimal inputs to make this really easy. So do you then need to understand the intricacies of app role? Well, you as the creator do, but the consumers don't. So you're going to go ahead, you're going to create the backend role for app role. You're going to create an associated secret ID. We're going to put a wrapping TTL on it so that you can actually pass back a wrapped response. And then we're going to use the template file function of Terraform to actually go ahead and render this Vault configuration for us. And it's going to pass through then a bunch of values, including some of the information about that app role that you actually created. If we take a look at the configuration file that's here in question, you can see here we're just transposing or transforming some of those variables and updating those. This is basically that configuration file that we just went through. And what this means then is that your knowledge and expertise about how to go about creating a certificate, about how to actually set up dynamic rotation and use auto authentication is actually being passed on to the users without them actually needing to know a great deal of what's going on at all. So nothing particularly clever there in terms of the code. Any outputs that you want to share, you would just declare those in exactly the same way as you would standardized Terraform code. All right, now that module doesn't actually exist here. So let's see whether or not I've actually managed to successfully push that through. Where are we? I'm just going to do a little bit of copy paste here because I can't type and talk at the same time. Modules. All right, so this is as simple as it actually becomes to actually add a module to Terraform Enterprise for you to actually consume. Some simple instructions, and if I hadn't been lazy with my README, you'd actually see a lot more information here to explain to you how you'd actually go about leveraging this. We can see here what the mandatory inputs are, and then other things such as optional inputs that have kind of had some defaults actually set to make life again a little bit easier. Now, again, when it comes to actually teaching people how to consume this, you can really get them started quite quickly within our configuration designer. And what that allows them to do is come in here and say, all right, so if I'm going to be provisioning workloads and I need to actually manage some stuff in here, what have I got? I've got the option to add myself a virtual server on the F5. I've got the ability to come in and add a module for my certificate request that we just saw. And yeah, for DDI, for IP address management and domain management, then we've got info blocks capabilities here. So I'm going to add that module. Basically, you can just throw in all the modules that you actually want to see. And what you're going to get on the next page then is the ability to run through and put in the values that you want. Now, in the real world use cases here, you're probably going to do a bit of deferring, right? Because as an example, I'm going to wait until I've got the IP address back from my infoblox server before I actually go ahead and create the pool or the node objects within my F5 virtual server. But this gives you then a great deal of sort of capability there. So let's just quickly go through and you'll see what you actually end up with. Configure, what have we got here required? I'll just defer that as well. And we can preview the configuration here, and you can see the items that I deferred come up saying, hey, we need to declare these variables. But underneath then come through the modules with a few of those very simple values, again, to really kickstart the idea of that deployment. And again, as I said, to take advantage of all of the intricacies of the configuration of these elements. Now, if I was to actually come in and take a look at this example. Thought I had that one open, my bad. I've closed all of my modules. All right, let's just, where are we? Terraform dash F5, no. Module dash F5 virtual server. All right, that's a little bit better. Let's maximize that to make it a bit easier and a bit larger. All right, so as you can see, there's a lot more information here. And look, to be honest, I'm only even taking advantage of a small number of those capabilities that are actually available within the F5. But each of these items then you can bring through all the specific configuration and again, start to really look at how you can actually scale this. Some of the smarts that you'll need to bring in and that you can bring your Terraform expertise to are things like how do we actually handle multiple objects. If I'm creating a pull attachment, then I need to create one for each of my nodes. So we're going to have to do things like looking at the count of the IP addresses that you're actually bringing through. When it comes to the node itself, then again, I'm actually reading that through from the node object, grabbing the count index, and in this case, we're actually dropping a specific port on, but you'd probably want to actually turn that into a variable more likely. So all of this, and then any of the additional capabilities of the F5 you could drop into the module. And that is really where we actually get the scale. And this is how we're actually able to take those learnings, take the expertise of your teams, and turn things like what has been traditionally really static infrastructure into stuff that is a lot more flexible and a lot more capable, a lot more programmable in order to speed up the delivery of applications and projects. All right, Pete, I will hand that back over there. I think we're on time.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. Great demo of Terraform Enterprise there. Thank you again.